You check your phone one more time before bed. Nothing urgent, nothing that can't wait until tomorrow. You set an alarm, pull up the blanket, and drift off, assuming tomorrow will simply arrive the way it always has. But somewhere tonight, a person is falling asleep knowing this is the last time they will ever do it. 24 hours left, and the real answer to what they do with that time is far stranger and far more human than you'd expect. For most of history, humans didn't get a countdown. Death arrived without warning, in the jaws of a predator, in a fever that spiked overnight, in a fall from a cliff edge. There was no clock ticking down. So what happens to the human mind when it finally gets one? Researchers have actually studied this. Not hypothetically, directly. In 2016, psychologists Sarah Hirschmuller and Boris Egloff analyzed the final statements of hundreds of death row inmates in the United States, people who knew, almost to the minute, when their life would end. They ran the words through linguistic software, measuring emotional tone, word choice, psychological markers. What did they expect to find? Despair, anger, fear, dressed up in language. What they actually found was the opposite. The closer these people got to their final hour, the more positive their language became. Words about love, words about gratitude, fewer swear words, fewer expressions of sadness as the moment of death approached. The emotional intensity of their statements increased right up until the end, but it tilted overwhelmingly toward warmth, not despair. And it wasn't a small effect, buried in statistical noise. It showed up consistently, across hundreds of cases, across different states, different backgrounds, different crimes. Men who had spent years in isolation, angry at the system, angry at fate, softened in exactly the same direction once the date was finally fixed. The researchers even tracked how the language changed over the final minutes versus the final hours versus the final days, and the pattern held at every distance. The nearer the deadline, the warmer the words. Why would a dying brain do that? To understand it, you have to go back further, to a book most people have never read. In 1973, anthropologist Ernest Becker published The Denial of Death, arguing that nearly everything humans build, culture, religion, art, ambition, exists to help you manage one unbearable fact. You know you are going to die, and no other animal walks around carrying that knowledge every single day. Becker believed this awareness sits underneath almost everything you do, quietly, like a hum you've learned to ignore. Decades later, 3 psychologists, Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pazinski, turned Becker's idea into an actual science. They called it terror management theory. Their experiments showed something remarkable. When you remind people of their own mortality, even briefly, their behavior shifts immediately. They cling harder to their beliefs. They favor people who share their values. They reach for whatever makes them feel like they are part of something that will outlast them. Solomon, Greenberg, and Pazinski ran hundreds of versions of the same basic experiment. Ask one group of people to think about death for 2 minutes. Ask another group to think about something neutral, a trip to the dentist, a boring afternoon. Then measure how each group behaves afterward. The death-primed group consistently became more defensive of their worldview, more generous toward people who agreed with them, more harsh toward outsiders. It was as if a switch flipped the moment mortality entered the room, even in the mildest possible form, a single sentence on a piece of paper. But here's the twist those experiments couldn't fully capture. Those were subtle reminders, a survey question, a news headline. What happens when the reminder isn't subtle at all? What happens when it's certain, immediate, and real? That's where the death row data gets strange again. As the execution date closed in, something in these individuals seemed to stop managing the terror and start metabolizing it. The fear didn't vanish, but it stopped running the show. What took over instead was something closer to resolution: gratitude toward family, apology toward victims, statements about peace, about faith, about love, arriving with more frequency the closer death got, not less. You might assume this is rare, unique to a handful of condemned men in a specific setting. It isn't. A palliative care nurse named Bronnie Ware spent years sitting beside people in the final weeks of their lives, and she began writing down what they told her they wished they'd done differently. Not once, in thousands of conversations, did anyone say they wished they'd worked more. Nobody wished for a bigger house, a faster promotion, a longer commute towards some future payoff. The regrets clustered instead around courage they didn't use, feelings they didn't express. friendships they let quietly disappear, and lives they lived for someone else's approval instead of their own. Ware noticed the same regret surfacing again and again, in different words, from different people, across different lives. Not one person mentioned their job title. Not one wished they'd answered more emails, or stayed later at the office, or climbed one more rung. The regrets were almost always about connection withheld, honesty postponed, love that stayed unspoken, because there always seemed to be more time to say it later. Doesn't that sound almost too simple, too neat, too much like a fortune cookie? Except it isn't simple at all, because it lines up almost perfectly with what the death row language study found, and with what terror management theory predicts happens when the abstract fear of death becomes concrete. When the clock is vague, somewhere out there, decades away, your mind defaults to status, comparison, accumulation. It optimizes for a future that feels infinite. But when the clock becomes specific, 24 hours, 1 week, the mind seems to recalibrate almost instantly. It stops asking what will make me look successful, and starts asking, who do I love, and do they know it? Think about what that actually implies. The version of you that shows up when death is close might not be a different person. It might be the truest version of you, the one buried underneath layers of long-term planning and slow-burning ambition, the one that only surfaces when there's no more time left to postpone it. Consider how much of your ordinary day is spent managing a future that may not even arrive the way you're imagining it. The promotion you're chasing, the apartment you're saving for, the version of your life you keep promising yourself once this one busy season finally ends. None of that is wrong, exactly, but almost none of it shows up in what people actually say with their final hours. It's as if the mind spends decades building an elaborate scaffolding around mortality, career, status, comparison, only to tear the whole thing down in the last 24 hours and reach for something much older, much simpler, underneath. So picture him, 24 hours left to live. He doesn't call a lawyer. He doesn't write a manifesto. In case after documented case, what actually happens is smaller and somehow larger at the same time. A phone call to a parent he hadn't spoken to properly in years. A letter to a child explaining, finally, the things he never said out loud. An apology, offered without any expectation of forgiveness, offered simply because it was true and needed saying. Ware's dying patients did the same thing on a slower timeline, working through the same short list, again and again. Love expressed, courage found, honesty finally spoken, right before the door closed for good. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. None of this required a countdown to become true. It was true this whole time. The friendship you're letting fade, the apology you're withholding, the person you haven't told how much they matter, none of that becomes more real the moment a doctor gives you a number. It's real right now. The countdown doesn't create the truth. It just strips away every excuse you've been using to avoid acting on it. And this isn't only true at the extreme edge of a countdown clock. Soldiers who survive near misses on the battlefield often describe the same shift, a sudden clarity about what actually matters, arriving in the seconds after they realize they almost didn't make it. People who survive serious accidents report it too. A strange, immediate reordering of priorities, the trivial things falling away almost instantly, the important people rising to the surface. The body doesn't need an execution date to trigger this response. It only needs a close enough brush with the ending to strip away the noise. Your ancestors never got a warning either. Death showed up uninvited, and there was no 24 hours to prepare, no final phone call, no letter finished just in time. Maybe that's exactly why humans built entire belief systems, entire rituals, entire religions around trying to say the important things early. Funerals that celebrate a life instead of just mourning a death. Deathbed traditions across nearly every culture that involve gathering loved ones close, saying it out loud, before it's too late to say it at all. Becker would say that's the whole point of culture, buying you a way to speak the unspeakable before the clock forces your hand.